aren't a lot of these decisions made with someone else or are affected by the presence of someone else? And so that's what really was the platform for all of my subsequent work, is looking at financial decision-making through a dyadic lens. How do we make these decisions with someone else? And what are the implications for our subsequent relationship dynamics?
Welcome to Modern Financial Wellness, the podcast dedicated to helping you feel better about your finances. I'm your host, Jim Grace, and I'll be your guide as we discuss the psychology of money and explore the emotional aspects that shape our financial decisions and how we feel about them. A quick note before we start: although I do hope that you find the information on this show to be helpful, in no way are any of these discussions to be taken as specific financial advice. Please do your own research and talk to your own advisors, especially when making important financial decisions. So, Jenny Olson, thank you so much for joining me on the show. It's great to see you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm really excited to talk to you. I think as a financial planner, as someone who's in a couples and money, couples and finance, financial decision-making is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. And you've done so much work in this space. I'm really excited to talk to you. So thanks again for being here. Before we get into some of your work and unpack this concept of, how do we do this? How do we merge finances, and what are some of the implications of our financial decision-making as a couple? Do you want to just give us a quick background on yourself, some of your work, and how you came to, be studying some of these things?
Sure. So thank you again for having me. So as you had noted, my name is Jenny Olson. I'm an assistant professor of marketing at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. I studied two broad areas of work. One is, consumer financial decision-making, and the other is social cognition. So how do we evaluate other people and ourselves, and how that impacts our decisions in the marketplace? And so a lot of my work centers on how do couples navigate financial decision-making, and how I came to this work, in addition to my own upbringing. So I grew up watching my parents, I don't want to name names, but one of my parents is a little bit more frugal around money, and the other's a little more spendthrift.
Typical.
And watching them, right? Yes, that's a typical union where we tend to marry our financial opposite, and watching them kind of hash it out over the kitchen table. And then when I found myself engaged, we faced this question of what do we do? And so I started, digging around, and my dissertation advisor at the time, Scott Rick at the University of Michigan, he also was really interested in financial decision-making. And so we started talking, and we quickly realized that a lot of the existing work was focused on individuals. How do people as individuals make saving and spending and retirement decisions? And then, I took a step back and I thought, but aren't a lot of these decisions made with someone else or are affected by the presence of someone else? And so that's what really was the platform for all of my subsequent work, is looking at financial decision-making through a dyadic lens. How do we make these decisions with someone else? And what are the implications for our subsequent relationship dynamics?
Right. And that you touch on an interesting point, and that comes up in the studies, how groundbreaking some of this work really is. It tended to be a lot of work around couples and money, or research specifically on trying to figure out how you go about making some of these decisions. You and your colleagues are really some of the first to really study that. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So yes, so my co-authors and I are kind of spearheading this mission to really study financial decision-making within pairs of people and within couples.
Why is that, do you think? And this might be a question to get us off topic, but why hasn't there been more attention paid to studying this particular topic? Because it's so impactful. And I see it as a practitioner as being such an important, thing to get right? Why not more attention?
I would say there are two reasons. If I had to guess, one of them is that this research is just really difficult logistically. You're not just recruiting individuals to take a survey. You have to recruit couples, and both partners have to be willing to participate. They have to be willing to come to the lab. And so just logistically, it's difficult. But also, I would say it's because it's a sensitive topic.
Right.
When you're talking about money, you're not just talking about today, you're talking about your childhood or your financial values. And, having conversations about money with your partner can bring about revelations that maybe we're not on the same page. And I think couples, sometimes it's a little bit scary,
right,
to participate in this sort of work. And so I think there's just a lot of difficulty around it, but that has not stopped my co-authors and I from, pushing this mission. Because like you said, I think it's super important, and we all are making these decisions every day. And so, I don't get afraid of challenge. So it's like, buckle up. I'm gonna tackle this.
Well, we're grateful for it. And I think you and I have talked in the past how I think it's fantastic that there is such a robust community within the topic of financial therapy. So the Financial Therapy Association, and money being a taboo subject that brings about a lot of emotional baggage oftentimes, is now finally starting to get a lot of attention, and there's a lot of work being done on kind of the emotional, mental health, emotional impact of money and money decisions. But I think it's really cool that you, again, and your colleagues are really spearheading some research to give us some data and some science, and what actually, what does the science say? Which is really, really cool. So thank you for that. I'm grateful for it. I guess we can jump into some of the work. I think 2 studies in particular that I'm most interested in. First is common sense, bank account structure and couples relationship dynamics. So translation, joint accounts. Should we merge our finances? How do we do that? And what are the implications? And then the other title of the study, which is a little juicier, Love, Lies, and Money, Financial Infidelity in Romantic Relationships. A really important, maybe misunderstood or poorly defined concept, which I think is worth touching on as well. So do you want to just set us up, maybe tell us a little bit about the common sense study to kind of kick us off? What were you looking at? What were you interested in trying to study? And how did you go about it?
Sure. So I'll give you a little bit of background on that, because I think the story leading up to it is really interesting. And so when I was doing my PhD at Michigan, I was engaged. And my now husband, I remember him coming to me and saying, "Hey, should we go get our joint account?" And I looked at him with this visceral reaction. I was like, no, I don't know. I like I don't want to merge finances with you. And he's like, "What are you talking about? Like, if we're getting married, we should be operating from the same pool." Like, his dad's a financial planner. And so he was very like, "Well, of course we're going to work together on this." And I remember just being like, "Oh, I don't know." And like a good academic, I was like, "Well, what does the literature say?" And so I looked at some of the research, and I found just a handful of papers that looked at the correlation between joint accounts and relationship satisfaction or happiness. And they tended to suggest that having a joint account predicts greater happiness. And I thought, okay, well, that's great, but that's a correlation. Is it the case that merging finances makes you happier? Or are happy couples simply more likely to merge their finances? Or is there some other variable? And we couldn't tease apart the direction of it. And so I went to Scott Rick, who was my dissertation chair. And he was like, "Funny you bring this up, because I've been batting around this idea with a couple colleagues, Deborah Small and Eli Finkel." And I was like, "Oh, maybe we should try to do an experiment on this. Like, that's the only way to get at causality, is to do an experiment." And so we were talking, we're like, there's no way we could pull off an experiment on this. You'd have to randomly assign people to different bank account structures. And, being the intrepid PhD student that I was, I'm like, we can do this. We can do this. And so
again,
I just—
challenging, right? To try to figure out how to set this up and actually get people to engage and participate. Yeah.
And to be fair, it took about a year of planning. We had to think through all of the logistics of this. What kind of couples are we going to recruit? Are we going to limit it to people entering their first union? Are we going to limit it to people that all have separate accounts? All these sorts of decisions we had to make. And so, long story short, we were able to come up with a solid design where we actively recruited either engaged or newlywed couples. So these are early stage couples, and everyone had to start with separate bank accounts. And that was important, so that the baseline was the same. And then we randomly assigned them to one of 3 different conditions. So we either said, we want you to keep separate accounts. We want you to merge accounts, discontinue your use of your separate accounts and merge them. Or in the third condition, it was called the no intervention condition. I think of it as choose your own adventure. We allowed the couples to do whatever they were naturally going to do. And so that way we have different conditions.
Can I just ask a quick question or make a highlight on the point of engaged or newlyweds? That seems to be, and it's highlighted and referenced often in the work, a critical time, right? For a lot of couples to figure out, is this going to work? And are you going to be able to predict being a happy couple in the future is what the relationship looks like, the systems and what's going on early on in the relationship, correct?
Correct. Yes. There's some work called, they call it the Connubial Crucible.
I was hoping I'd get to use that term, but thank you for pronouncing it correctly so I didn't have to butcher it.
I like to slide that into casual conversations. Like, have you heard of it? So it's the first 2 years of marriage. And they find that these first 2 years are very critical for setting up long-term marital fate. So the dynamics that are in place early on tend to predict the dynamics later.
Right.
And so for us, we thought, well, given that's the case within marriage, I think we need to tackle early stage couples because as you can imagine, financial lives get a lot more complex. You know, if you've been married 10 years, there might be other sorts of financial demands like caring for children or parents, things like that.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure everyone was starting out early.
And my wife and I, when we merged our finances, we talked about this recently, the stakes were a lot lower, right? In those beginning phases of our relationship, when you move in together, you get engaged, but it gets a lot more serious and complex as you get older. You start having kids and buying houses. And we, because it was easy, we had dual income and no kids and nothing to worry about. We didn't pay enough attention, I think, early on to talk about how we were going to merge our finances. Fortunately for us, later on, we're able to unpack some of that and put in some work and kind of get aligned and move forward. But I remember those being engaged in those early newlywed years, we didn't really have a care in the world. So we might not have been paying enough attention about the decisions we were making financially as we should have in those early years. So,
well, I think you nailed something. I don't think a lot of people do. It's more of like, this is just something we should do, but there's not a ton of discussion around it. And as you noted, like later on, like if I were to get married today, it would be a lot different, because when we were starting, I was a grad student at the time and he was working as a city planner. And so we were like, well, we don't have as much money. If we merge, we'll have more. Right.
Yeah.
We were managing two different households because I was in Ann Arbor and he was in a different city. And so, whereas now, like as you get older, you like, let's say for college, aging parents, are we going to support our parents, as they're getting older?
Right.
New cars and phone. I mean, it just gets infinitely more complex. So it was very important to us to really focus on early stage couples. And subsequent work can look at maybe longer term dynamics.
Right. And we, I think over time, we were making decisions without a lot of thought or discussion. We start with like, well, we'll split rent, right? We should have a joint account because that makes sense. And then the utilities make sense and cable, but you're still very much operating out of separate accounts. And over time, we kind of scaled that back and moved joint. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. So you've set up these three groups of individuals. They're going to merge their finances in three unique, specific ways. And what did you find out?
So the other thing I should mention is that we then followed these couples for 2 years. So we surveyed both partners at 6 different time points because our goal was to look at marital trajectories. So is it the case that joint accounts make people happier over time, maybe less happy, maybe there's an initial like dip, that sort of thing. And so before I share our results, it's important to note that whenever we look at longitudinal studies of marriage, relationship satisfaction generally declines. So we expect people to just naturally become less happy over time. And there's lots of reasons for that. So the literature talks about things like disillusionment. The initial high of that wedding day kind of wanes. I kind of joke with my own husband now where I'm like, our Saturdays are now going to Costco. Like that's the highlight, right?
Yeah.
And so no longer like, going out to the clubs and all that stuff. It kind of, the mundane realities kind of set in.
That's
and
along those lines.
Oh,
one of the things that I'm anti in our space, often it's encouraged to have money dates where you sit
Yeah.
down, and I think it's important that couples talk about money, but I'm just anti the term because, again, our Saturdays are going to Home Depot. We're in the middle of a project right now, or basketball with the kids. The last thing I think either one of us want to do is have a date and talk about finances. It's, if we get a chance to go spend some time together. So anyway, I digress.
We'll talk about the money dates later.
Okay,
yes.
Cool.
So that's always the general suggestion. But yeah, so we followed these couples for 2 years, and on average, we expect people to decline. And so in the no intervention condition, we did find that the couples who were left to their own devices naturally declined in satisfaction over time, or relationship quality is what we called it. It was a composite of a few variables. People that were randomly assigned to the separate accounts condition also declined over time. However, the couples who were randomly assigned to merge their finances were buffered against that decline and actually trended upwards. They did not significantly improve over time, but they held more constant. And so these trajectories then had an effect at the 2-year mark, where people that were randomly assigned to the joint condition were actually significantly better off than couples in the other 2 conditions, suggesting that joint accounts are indeed good for marriage, especially over time.
Right. So it's not necessarily going to make you wildly more happy, but it seems to eliminate the opportunity for problems, right?
Yeah.
And it gets
decline.
Yeah. So why do you think that is? What's good about joint accounts? Did you look at anything else and have any other takeaways or thoughts on that? And what's your feeling on why that is?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Like, that's in behavioral science. The next question is always, well, why? Like, what's the underlying mechanism? And so we included a few other variables to look at potentially why, people in the joint condition might be better off. And we think there could be 3 reasons. One is financial harmony. So having a joint account can improve happiness surrounding money. As we know, money is one of the lead predictors of divorce and unhappiness in marriage. So if we can get people aligned and working together from a shared pool of resources, that can help predict, relationship satisfaction. So we ask things like, how satisfied are you with your partner's attitudes toward money? How happy are you with the amount you and your partner are saving and spending? And so it can help with financial harmony. And we do find evidence that can explain that trajectory. We also think that joint accounts preserve the communal nature of marriage.
That's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. Can you explain that a little bit? Because I think that's a huge point in all of this conversation.
Yeah. So there, in the relationship science literature, there is a distinction between communal relationship norms and exchange relationship norms. And so exchange is very tit for tat business. I'm going to help my partner because they're going to help me. I'm going to do the dishes tonight because I expect you to do the laundry later. So it's very tit for tat. There's more scorekeeping. Like if you feel like there's inequities, you're going to argue. And we theorize that reflects more of a separate account condition scenario. Like, you pay this, I pay that. If you do this, I do that. The communal relationship norm, on the other hand, is we help our partners because they need the help. There is no expectation of future reciprocity, and there is no expectation of prepaying for later favors. So I'm going to do the dishes because of something that we need to do. I'm going to pick up the kids from school because I know you have a work deadline. It's not that I expect you to do it later. And with a communal relationship norm, we thought that would be more akin to a joint account. There's a shared pool of resources. It makes it more difficult to monitor each other's inputs and outputs because it's all together.
Right.
And so we do find some correlational evidence of communal norms. We ran a subsequent survey and we asked people who had joint accounts about these different things, and they did indeed report greater sense of communality. You can also think of it as a we versus I.
Right.
It's you, me versus us.
Right.
And so communal is more us.
Right. It's like the what plays out in reality of the saying, what's mine is yours, right? I think everybody that enters into a relationship, clients throw it around, or I've even thrown it around in passing and joking, well, what's mine is yours, babe, right? We're all going to share this, but it's really meaningful to try to support one another in a lot of ways, right? Not only doing the dishes, but what we pay for as a couple should be a shared responsibility of both partners, right?
Right.
So it's a really interesting concept. I find talking about that often, about whether or not we should have a joint account. And there's just always this idea, and even my wife and I have practiced this, where we've kept a small separate account, and that was kind of like our own little slush fund in the beginning of our relationship, and a little bit of money went into each account, and we could do whatever we wanted with that, and it was kind of outside the budget for the family. And that worked for us for a while, but what we found is we tended to gravitate towards just paying for everything out of the joint accounts anyway, and it kind of made these separate accounts that we had obsolete, and we really primarily just operate out of the joint account now, because of that communal relationship and that kind of shared, support system that we've wanted to create. So it's interesting.
Yeah, so like all of ours. And actually, you raise a really good point about partial merging. So having, one joint account and then, two separate accounts. And we didn't look at that scenario in our experiment, but we do have some correlational evidence that they tend to be in the middle between the full merge and the full separate. And I know that it's possible that that scenario could be really ideal for some couples. And I think it could be helpful because as long as that money is still funneling through the joint account, you could still enjoy those relational benefits.
Right.
And just like my husband and I, we actually have separate credit cards, but then according to my research standards, we have joint accounts, but yeah, we each have that little bit of autonomy.
That's an interesting,
but that's still all through the joint account.
Yeah, and that's probably why we're so comfortable with it, is because it's all kind of being paid for, funneling through the joint account to begin with. So even though they're separate accounts, in reality and in practice, they're really more of a communal relationship. Yeah, cool. That's interesting. So, one of the things I found interesting in the study was this idea of making it more prompting a spouse, if you're operating out of a joint account, to think about how to justify your spending, almost creating a shared accountability, right? With everything's out in the open as a step one to a joint account.
Yeah. So my co-authors actually published a paper, Joe Gladstone and Emily Garbinski, looking at when couples have joint accounts, they're more likely to buy things that are easily justifiable because you anticipate having that conversation, like some more utilitarian functional purchases compared to more luxurious sorts of things. So once everything's out in the open, it's fair game to be judged, so to speak.
Yeah. So kind of nudging towards good financial behavior and decision making, because it's all out in the open. I'm going to have to justify this with my spouse or partner. The other thing that I pulled out was just the idea of transparency and open communication as kind of a cornerstone to any healthy relationship, right? It just forces you to talk to your partner about what's going on, which oftentimes isn't the case in a lot of relationships when it comes to money.
Yeah, because once everything's available, like I can log on to our Chase account and I could see every line item. I know exactly what is going in, what's going out, and that can facilitate healthier conversations about meeting our shared goals. And that was actually the third mechanism I was going to mention, is that we theorize that having a joint account can help people align their financial goals. Like if we're working together to save for a retirement or even just a vacation, we have to work together and talk about that and continually monitor our progress toward that. And if we have a joint account, that facilitates that process.
Yeah, which is great. And not enough time, I think, gets spent. I know we fall victim to this sometimes as well, is not really focusing on what it is we're trying to accomplish together. Why are we buying all this stuff in the first place as kind of a starting point? So when everything's in the joint account, you have a system to sit down and start talking about it. That's all positive, right? As a step one. So very cool. Was there anything else in the common sense study that you'd like to call attention to? Because I want to bring up this idea of financial infidelity a little bit, because I think it's important. But was there anything before we move to that you'd want to kind of call out or spotlight for folks?
Sure. I would say, so one question I often get asked is, are joint accounts best for everyone? Like, what if you're in a situation where there could be some financial abuse or, other complex situations? And so we always say that, we are not necessarily saying that joint accounts are ideal for all couples in all situations. There's going to be, gray areas and there's going to be more nuance. But we do say that based upon the evidence, all else being equal, our results do suggest that, a joint account can be ideal for marriage, especially having that conversation early on. And so I think that our results at least warrant that conversation, so that the two partners can make an informed decision about, what's going to work for them.
Yeah, that's great. And again, focusing on making good decisions, merging your finances the right way in that connubial crucible period of time and that newlywed phase, if you will, is so critical. So that's fantastic. And again, we're appreciative of the work that you've put into this. It's super helpful to kind of think through and apply. Not to completely switch gears because it's definitely related, but the idea of financial infidelity, I've shared that term with folks, and you kind of get this kind of startled look when you say things like that. It's like, well, what does that mean? Financial cheating. What does that look like? Can you help us define that a little bit? And
for sure. So I will give you a little bit of background on that one too. So Christina Nikolova and I were talking about this. We were like, hey, we both have some cool work in this, relationship space, and we're both intrigued by this idea of financial infidelity. We had saw a couple pop press articles floating around at the time. And then we found out Joe Gladstone and Emily Garbinski were also working on or starting something along those lines. And so we joined forces and we're like, all right, we're going to study financial infidelity. And then we almost looked around at each other in our Zoom room and we thought, what is it?
Yeah.
What is this? We were seeing this term flying around. Is this something like I'm going to buy a candy bar at the store and not tell my partner, all the way to having a completely separate life with another partner in different financial structures? And so we actually had to take a step back and we thought, you know what? Our first paper on this topic is going to be defining this construct. What is it? What is it not? And how can we measure it in a reliable, valid way? So we operated from that set of assumptions. And the first thing we did is we asked a big sample of married people, how do you define this? What is this? Like cheating with money? What kind of behaviors, And so through that process, we came to a definition of financial infidelity that involves two elements.
Did you find a wide variability in definitions when you talk to couples? I'd imagine the answers that you got were all over the place.
Yes. So we got a broad range of behaviors, but they all shared similar components. And that's how we were able to drill it down. So people mentioned things like, I got a bonus at work and I didn't tell my partner. I gambled and lost some money and I didn't tell my partner. I have more student loan debts than I want to share with my partner, all these sorts of things. And we identified two different things that underlied all of it. One was making some sort of a financial decision that you anticipated would be disapproved of. So I anticipate disapproval from my partner. And the second piece is then actively concealing it. So hiding it in some way. So, as one example, and we kind of joke about this and whenever we give talks on this, it was myself. So I went to a salon and I was like, oh, this bill is adding up. I got my hair colored and cut and all this. And I thought, oh, this is pretty high. My partner might not approve of this. And so then I concealed it by using my personal credit card. So that way he can't see it. Or hiding your Amazon packages because you expect disapproval from your partner. So it has to include expected disapproval and concealment. If your partner doesn't really care, then it's not financial infidelity. If you don't hide it, then it's not financial infidelity. It really has to have these two components together for us to call it financial infidelity.
Right. And it's the expectation of. So if your expectation is that your partner is going to disapprove, and maybe if they in reality wouldn't, it's still financial infidelity because you're expecting that disapproval during the
And that was something that we talked about. Like, does it require actual disapproval? And we said no, because you operate out of expectation.
So how did you set up this study? Because you can't, it's immoral, right? In your world, unethical, I guess, is the better description to try to encourage people to set up secret, bank accounts. And so how did you look at this and what were some of the interesting findings when you started to study it a little bit deeper?
Oh my gosh. That was a debate we had too. So going through the review process, we were like, well, and that was one reason we think that people haven't studied this is because, again, it's very secretive behavior and people don't want to admit it. And so we use more correlational designs in the sense that we developed a scale to capture this variability in people. And so we measured the scale in individuals, and then we gave them different choices. And we were able to find that people who have higher financial infidelity proneness, so they're more likely to engage in these behaviors, it predicted a lot of different marketplace decisions. So it was things like, going to a store that has like a general name versus a really specific boutique name, so that, you look on the credit card statement, and you're like, what's this special pot and pan thing versus Target? Choosing nondescript packaging. You notice how Amazon allows you to have things packaged in its original thing versus not. So we
did not know that. That's an option. Oh, okay.
I've selected it a few times. Don't tell Nathan that. Where you can have it like put it in its own packaging or not. And so if it's in packaging, you can see what it is.
Amazon in and of itself is difficult. I'm curious what your financial planner husband thinks about this, but it's difficult when you're going through and you're trying to track and categorize your expenses and do some bookkeeping when it just says Amazon. It's like, well, what is this in and of itself? I didn't realize there was a second layer of discretion that you could apply to the packaging itself when it comes in the house.
Yeah. I buy things. So I have 2 young children, and it's, it's like, hey, there's this trampoline. Do you want it in its original packaging or a separate box? I'm like, separate box, please. But no, then he sees it in the basement, of course.
Right.
I was like, you clearly got that. But yeah, we measured it in that sense. We did a couple field studies where we gave people an opportunity to conceal things and to see if our scale predicted their likelihood of concealing, and indeed it did. So we gave things like, you could either have a massage just for yourself or a couples massage for both of you. And people that were more likely to engage in financial infidelity were more likely to make some more selfish choices. And so we demonstrated this in a broad variety of contexts. And a few of my co-authors and I are currently examining the dynamics within couples. So if one partner has a strong propensity to engage in financial infidelity and the other does not, does that create extra problems in the marriage versus if we're both aligned? So an alignment's interesting because we might both do it, probably okay, because there's an understanding, or we neither do it, also good. But what about that? And we do find the more asymmetric you are, the less you save, the less happy you are, things like that.
Interesting. So it's so important. And going back to kind of the merging of bank accounts is, to me, it all comes down to transparency, right? And when there's a lack of transparency and open communication, it just presents the opportunity for things like this to happen. And I, hear it, it's like, well, if he's willing to keep, $100 gambling debt, or maybe something a little bit more serious financially, if he's willing to keep something like that from me, what else is he willing to kind of keep me from? It opens up this Pandora's box of distrust when you're not being forthcoming, right, with everything that's happening in your financial life. And to kind of connect the two studies, when I was looking, by having joint accounts, it almost by default eliminates the opportunity for financial infidelity. Am I kind of connecting that right?
Yes. And we also theorize that, like, by having joint accounts, it makes it more difficult. Because if everything is available and visible, like we can both log on to our banking website and see everything, it makes it a lot more difficult to conceal these purchases. There's still ways, of course, but it makes it more difficult if things are more open and honest. And you also touched on a point that we talked about as well is financial infidelity inherently harmful? And so in the paper we were agnostic to harm because it could manifest differently in different couples. But we kept circling back to the point that you just made, Jem, about if you are holding back some sort of information, it implies distrust. And that is what could be potentially harmful. And so, and now we're showing that in our new paper that, there can be some financial as well as relationship well-being harm.
And that's a really interesting part of that. So I think it's just intuitive, right? If you're keeping something from your partner, you're willfully concealing your behavior. That's bad, right? That's going to cause problems. But you started to touch on in your work, you're starting to see potentially less saving, less investment, bad financial behavior compounding over time. So being impactful financially, which is a really interesting aspect of all of that.
So it all goes back to the trust. It's like underlying thing. So yeah.
You're almost shooting yourself in the foot, right? So I'm concealing this little financial behavior because I'm worried about, judgment from my spouse, but yet I potentially might be making myself less well off over time by operating that way. It's really interesting.
Yeah, you're like secretly spending all this stuff that then harms the couple's ability to meet joint financial goals. So anytime you're operating independently, there's that opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, it's intuitive and makes a lot of sense, but I think to kind of just circle back to the key takeaways, merging finances, joint bank accounts are all positive, adds to the transparency, opens up good communication, supports that communal nature aspect of your relationship. Is there anything else you'd like to, maybe spotlight in some of this work, important takeaways? Is there anything you'd like to add before we let you go?
I would say, so we don't have, longitudinal data on outcomes 10 years from now, but given the work, I would argue that this decision about how to structure your finances is very important early on. So I encourage couples to have that conversation early on because we do see results even after 2 years. And we know based upon the Connubial Crucible work that those dynamics then shape all these subsequent things. And so if we're on the same page at day one, financial infidelity probably becomes less likely down the road if we're on the same page from day one. And so it's very important to have these conversations and have them early,
right,
and repeatedly. This isn't a one and done thing. So we were talking about the money dates. It's not enough just to sit down one night for an hour and be like, well, we're done, never have to revisit this, because priorities change, values change. Different circumstances can come up and you have to be able to roll with the punches, so to speak. And so having that conversation often. And the other thing related to conversations, I also have a new paper that we're getting ready to submit where we actually find that people expect financial conversations to be a lot worse than they are.
Great point.
Which is amazing. Like we recruited all these married people and we said, we're going to have you have a financial conversation tonight with your partner. How do you think it's going to go?
Anxiety inducing, right?
Yeah. Is it going to bring you together? Is it going to tear you apart? All these sorts of things. And then the next day we followed up and we said, hey, did you have the conversation? And if they said yes, and most of them do, how did it go? And we asked them the exact same set of questions. And we find that it goes a lot better than they think. And so people might have this hesitation, but in reality, it's probably going to go better than you think because, again, it brings you together. You get united on the same page and you're operating from that we perspective.
Right, right. And, we talked about that earlier on. Money in general, it's difficult to talk about. It's a taboo subject. And that's why maybe it hasn't been studied as much as it should be. And it's difficult for people to sit down and really get intimate with their partner when it comes to finances. But I think you're 100% right. I've seen that in my own life and how my wife and I operate. We have to just stay consistent with it and as consistent as we can. And it evolves over time. As somebody who's been married almost 10 years now, it changes. Kids get in the way. Sometimes we're really diligent and on top of it. And there's other times where we haven't done it for a week, but we have to kind of keep remembering to come back to the table and have those conversations. And I think you're 100% right. It's critical that you do that as soon as possible. The sooner the better, so that you can set yourself up for success, down the road as a couple. And one interesting thing along those lines, you mentioned in one of the studies that actually recommending joint accounts can improve financial well-being in couples and happiness overall. So I think it can't be overstated enough that, merging your finances the right way and having these conversations is really important. So we appreciate you sharing your work today. Before I let you go, where should people check out your work? Do you have a website you want to spotlight? Anything that you want to share with folks? Where do people find you?
Yes. So again, my name is Dr. Jenny Olson, and I'm an assistant professor of marketing at the Kelley School of Business. And I have a personal website, jennyolson.com. And there you can find links to my papers, contact information. And I love hearing from people. So feel free to contact me.
Cool. Two quick last questions. One, are there any books, any of your colleagues' work, websites, podcasts, anything that you're interested in along these lines or outside even your own field of study that you'd want to spotlight for folks?
I am happy to spotlight two books by two of my co-authors on this paper on common sense. So Dr. Scott Rick is coming out with a book in January on tightwads and spendthrifts in marriage.
It's a great title.
He has a series of papers on this topic, looking at how tightwads tend to marry spendthrifts and then all the friction that can cause. He also talks about this paper in the book and how to navigate those financial conversations. And Eli Finkel also has a book called The All or Nothing Marriage. And one of the central thesis of that book is that over time, we've come to expect even more out of our marital partner. So it used to be much more, we're marrying for basic survival needs, like we just have to fight off, defend ourselves from threats and things. But over time, now we expect our partner to bring out the best in us as well. And like all this self-actualization. And so I would highlight those two books. I think they're All or Nothing Marriage is already out, but then Scott's book is also coming out in January. So those are the two books I would recommend.
That's great. I appreciate it. And last question. This is a show about financial well-being in general. Do you have any habits or rituals, practices that you come back to just make yourself feel better and get back on track that you'd be willing to share?
That I have a penchant for artisanal lattes. And reflections at coffee shops. So I love going to coffee shops and just sitting. And I like writing poetry off and on, get my creative juices flowing. I also love Instagram, creating images of things. As I mentioned, I have a 4-year-old and a 6-month-old, and I like capturing their messy moments where they're real and just, awesome. Spending time family, friends.
That's awesome. I'm a huge supporter of the artisanal latte, especially if you're sitting in reflection. If that's meaningful and purposeful for you, have at it. You've got my permission as a financial planner to go ahead and spend the $5 and $6 if that's an important part of your day. So we appreciate you sharing that, Jenny. Thank you so much. I'm such a huge fan of the work. I think it's really important. It's practical. It applies to all of us and couples that are trying to figure this out. So thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Take care.